Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, and I welcome you all for this valedictory function. Dr. Jay Singh, virtual colleagues, friends, scholars, and students. Now it is my proud privilege to introduce Dr. Jay Singh, though he has already established himself as an erudite academician and organizer par excellence from day one of our conference. I have to take upon myself the pleasant responsibility of sharing with you all his credentials. The first statement to his credit I would like to attribute is he is a teacher who always says a big, broad, smiling yes to any kind of academic program, which indirectly says he never articulates no. Dr. Jaisingh enriches the Department of India and World Literatures as an assistant professor in the Central University called the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. His areas of specialization are contemporary theory, post-colonial theory and literature, Indian writing in English, diaspora literature, feminism, cultural studies, Orientalism, and digital humanities. He has visited many countries like Finland, Hungary, Bangladesh, and Bhutan, and has taken up many international academic assignments. He has published 2 books, and more than 40 papers are there to his credit. He has honored many workshops, review boards, editorial boards, and research journals by contributing his unique credential. This is only a part of his CV. The topic he has chosen for today is Decoding Diaspora, a journey from real time and space to the virtual world. Sir, your topic is essentializing the decodings or exploration of all the scholars who have immersed themselves in the diaspora ocean. Everyone is already excited about this journey to the virtual world, and the chat box stands testimony to this. Time and space can never be restricted, nor can be fully understood in the world of flex. Sir, we are enthusiastically waiting to interact with your ideas. The online is yours. Please, Dr. Jay Singh.
Thank you, ma'am. And ma'am, from now onwards, if somebody comes in the waiting room, you just admit
Okay,
them to the phone.
I will do, sir. I will do it.
So I'm highly thankful to the principal of Villalar College, the convener, Dr. L.M. Somlata, who gave me, who introduced me so nicely to you, all of you, organizing secretary, Dr. A. Vanita, and other faculty members of the college, as well as all the people, all the paper presenters, resource persons who are listening to me and who listened to earlier sessions also. So I'm thankful to all of you. As the topic of my talk is decoding diaspora. The term diaspora is extremely simple and equally difficult as well. Why it is so simple? Whenever we talk about the term diaspora, immediately we are reminded of NRIs, non-resident Indians, the people of Indian origin who migrated to the first world for so many reasons. Now they are the diaspora. And if they write some novel, some story, something, that immediately becomes part of diaspora literature. So it is the extremely simple definition of diaspora. But when we talk about decoding diaspora, The term is extremely complex to decipher. Why? Because diaspora in itself is a political term with numerous political agendas and connotations associated with it. It is not that simple. And why it is not that simple, I will explain it. Not all displaced people are called diaspora, and many other communities that are called diaspora now were not called diaspora historically. In some other cases, some communities do not want to be known as diaspora, while there are some other communities struggling for the diaspora tag. It's not just about movement. A writer moves from one political unit to another political unit, one geographical area to another geographical area, and writes something, and he immediately becomes a diaspora writer. If that is so, if it is so, then E.M. Foster, who moved from England to India, he took employment under one Indian king, and while he was in India, he wrote a novel, but he is not a diaspora. Nobody ever considered him a diaspora. The first Nobel laureate of English literature, Rudyard Kipling, was born in India. You may call him second generation diaspora in India, but he is not called a diaspora at all. On the other hand, many writers of Indian origin who have moved to USA or Canada or some other place, they haven't yet left the Indian citizenship, but they are immediately accepted as a diaspora writer. On the one hand, nobody is ready to accept them as diaspora writers, and on the other hand, some other writers are accepted diaspora writers immediately without any question. So it makes this term very complicated. And another thing about diaspora studies as a discipline is a new addition to the academic world. Phil Cohen says, before 1990s, there was little academic interest in the term diaspora, and a few publications with diaspora as a theme were primarily concerned with the historical Jewish or African experience. Post 1990, there is a mass proliferation of written work as well as a huge diversification in terms of those groups who come under the diaspora rubric. A close study of movement of people across geographical boundaries and political boundaries shows that people have always moved across the world. However, not every movement is termed as diaspora movement. There are forces that determine only certain movements as diaspora movements. Mary Oath, while analyzing the diaspora boom as a phenomenon of the Western intellectual market, quotes Timothy Vernon, who argues that the fascination with the term hybrid cultures of diaspora communities tends to obscure the fact that very often these people themselves do not want to be diasporic. They may not want the term diaspora associated with with themselves. As mentioned earlier, not all movements are called diaspora movements, and not all such settlers are called diaspora. The very idea of diaspora revolves around the rights over the land one lives on. Now the question is, why the movement of the people when an Indian moves from India to America or Europe is immediately considered a diaspora, and why uh, why Rudyard Kipling or E.M. Foster were never considered diaspora? The reason lies in a very, very important fact, that is the right over the land one lives on. In the age of nation states, the most important concern is who owns the nation land, and the community that owns the nation terms other settlers as diaspora, and at the same time, the communities that are persuaded to demand and accept the diaspora status forego their claim on the nation. Therefore, the idea of diaspora is very much ingrained in the idea of who owns the nation and hence a deeply political term. While reflecting on the relationship between geographical space, people living on it, and the idea of nation, Deleuze and Guattari says, it's a little longer quotation, but I will like to read this quotation in entirety because it is important to understand the relationship between land, people, and nation. Because without nation, there is no diaspora. The constituents of the nation are a land and a people. The natal, which is not necessarily innate, and the popular, which is not necessarily pre-given. The problem of the nation is aggravated in the two extreme cases. And what are the two extreme cases? A land without a people and a people without a land. How can a people and a land be made? In other words, a nation. The coldest and bloodiest means vie with upsurges of romanticism. The axiomatic is complex and is not without questions. The natal or the land, as we have seen elsewhere, implies a certain deterritorialization of the territories, community land, imperial provinces, caesurial domains, etc., and the people, a decoding of the population. The nation is constituted on the basis of these flows and is inseparable from the modern state that gives consistency to the corresponding land and people. It is the flow of naked labor that makes the people. Now, who are the people? The naked flow, the flow of the naked labor that makes the people, just as it is the flow of the capital that makes the land and its industrial base. In short, the nation is the very operation of a collective subjectification to which the modern state corresponds as a process of subjection. It is in the form of the nation state with all its possible variations that the state becomes the model of realization of the capitalist axiomatic, and under these circumstances, diaspora emerges as a very important category of people, a very important political term, a very important administrative term as well. And of course, literary everybody knows. As the question of land and people are integral to nation, so they are integral to the notion of diaspora as well. There are communities that have all the traits of diaspora. However, neither they call themselves diaspora nor anyone else ever considered them diaspora. In this regard, Janet Wilson says, settler invader societies, notably the white dominions of Canada, Australia and New Zealand, which originated as migrations from Britain as the imperial mother country, are defined as ethno-national communities, diasporas, that is dispersed groups that share a collective history, common ancestry, ethnicity, and national traits, associated with a specific homeland and maintain a symbolic relationship with the homeland through common constructs and shared affinities. See, Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, they all have their associations with England, the most important colonizing country. But in one way, they are all diaspora who decided not to come back to their mother country at all. And many of whom have come also in the history. So the white settlers or white diaspora who colonized these places and settled there still long for and recognize themselves with Great Britain, the colonizer's homeland. However, all other people who moved to these places, excuse me. Hello. Hello. Sir, मैं ना group meeting में the notion of structured feeling, these are the white settlers. However, all other, the colonizer homeland, however, all other people who moved to these places after the colonizers settled themselves as rulers were termed as a diaspora, and with the power of intellectual and economic investment convinced to feel like diaspora. To borrow the phrase from Raymond Williams, that is, the feeling of diaspora is structured feeling. So Raymond Williams gave an idea of the structure of feeling. So if I borrow the idea from Raymond Williams, it becomes the feeling of diaspora is a structured feeling. However, it may come naturally to the people, but it is not natural. We think of whatever we feel is natural to us, but it is not natural, rather it is structured. In the same way, the feeling of being a diaspora is also a structured feeling. This notion is structured feeling is valid because if it is a natural human feeling, then the white settler must also experience it. That is not the case. On the contrary, the white settlers' exhibition of displacement and longing for the colonial homeland have conventionally been projected in terms of nation building rather than as a diaspora yearning for motherland. Robin Cohen, he wrote a very important essay. The title of the essay is Seeds, Roots, Rhizomes, Epiphytes, Botany and Diaspora. In this essay, Robin Cohen foregrounds rootedness as one of the features of diaspora and highlights the role played by non-white diaspora rather than white settlers when he says roots, or most strictly the search for roots, are a frequent motif in diasporic life. When we talk about diaspora, the most important thing associated with the diaspora is the search for roots. Now, why only the people who are settled in the first world from third world search for their roots? Why not the white people search for their roots? It's a big question. Americans, why they have their roots in Britain? Why they do not search for their roots in Britain or rather France or Spain? Because most of the people, the white people in America moved from these places only. Why only the people of color will search for the roots? And the reason is it is part of politics that emotionally diaspora do not belong to the land where they have settled. When a person is labeled diaspora, it means the person does not have natural right on the land. So his emotional and natural rights on the land are curtailed. That is why some people are made diaspora, some others are not made diaspora. People don't become diasporas, they are made diaspora. This is my claim. In many instances, it is the non-European or non-white who led the movement to such roots, for instance, and they convinced a lot of economic and intellectual investment in the field, finally convinced the people of color that they have to search for their roots. And that's why this movement to search roots is headed by non-European and non-whites. One can cite the sentiments of the prominent New World leader of the black leaders of the Back to Africa movement, Marcus Garvey, a people without the knowledge of their past. What Marcus Garvey says, A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Many African Americans undertook a painful emotional journey to connect with their past. But though the blacks from America moved to Africa, but the whites from America did not move to England to search their roots. The idea of rootedness while determining the diaspora status is problematic because it is based on the notion of power, who owns the land. Therefore, white European Christian is not a diaspora neither on this earth nor even in space because they own both earth and outer space. On the other hand, all others are diaspora, perhaps, except in the place of their ethnic origin. And however, even in the places where they are living for thousands of years, they are tagged outsiders by the radical nationalists who are in turn products of the Western colonialism. Another way to establish the political dimension of diaspora is to study the etymology and the first use of the term along with various colors along with various colors that it takes up to contemporary period. The term diaspora has many connotations, just like as a religious term, as an academic term, as a category of practice, as a scientific concept, as a part of the international bureaucratic lexicon. The first use of the term diaspora occurred around the 3rd century BCE in the Greek translation of Hebrew Bible, and it refers to the divine punishment that would befall the Jews if they did not respect the commandments of God. In its initial meaning, movement away from motherland and back was a matter of divine justice, not human will. By the 1st century CE, the meaning changes when the New Testament refers to diaspora as the member of the Christian church has exiled from the city of God and dispersed across the earth. However, at a later stage, Christian writers see how the meaning of the term changes politically. The Christian writers eventually abandoned diaspora in the 2nd century CE, limiting its use to the Jewish dispersion as an exemplary curse for their sins, with the replacement of Greek by Latin within the Western Roman Empire in the 1st centuries of the Christian era. Diaspora is confined to the Eastern Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire. Again, during the 18th century, a new religious movement emerges with the rise of the Protestant Moravian Church in Germany that officially calls diaspora the nomadic church that helps maintain the link between the various Moravian communities dispersed into Catholic lands. Slowly, the term diaspora moves out of religious dictionary and enters political and academic dictionary, as Stephen Dufour says. From the first decade of the 20th century onwards, two distinct processes characterize the evolution of diaspora. That is secularization. Secularization means the extension to non-religious meaning and the widening of the spectrum of relevant cases. Diaspora starts a new life as an academic notion without any formal definition that may encompass more than one relevant case. Since this time onwards, scholars started using the term to include more and more people who have moved away from their motherland. For instance, Jewish Russian historian Simon Dubnow, in his entry on diaspora in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, provides a vision of the phenomenon that goes beyond the Jewish case to include Greeks and Armenians. A few years later, American sociologist Robert E. Parr relied on Dubnow's writing to reframe and even enlarge the scope of diaspora and applied it to Asians. So around 1950s, it was applied for the Asians for the first time. It was in the 1950s, British anthropologist Maurice Friedman made a similar attempt to demonstrate that Chinese and Indians constitute other diasporas. With the passage of time, in the 20th century, the word is progressively used by social actors from various racial, religious, or ethnic groups and associations to describe their connection to a land or state different from the one they lived in. Around 1970s, diaspora studies started emerging in academic discipline and are being institutionalized. One stream of the discipline relies on the paradigmatic Jewish case, sees diaspora as characterized by either migration or exile, nostalgia, perpetuation of original traditions, customs and languages, and a dream to return to the homeland. In this respect, this is centered. The first movement is centered, essentially political version of the. So in this respect, this is centered, essentially political version of diaspora. On the other hand, the second stream relies on the Black African case. Its origin lies in the evolution of British cultural studies from the mid 1970s onward towards a greater attention to identity issues. British sociologists Stuart Hall and Paul Gilroy epitomized this version. Both versions of diaspora are political. The first one is modern, centered, territorial, and political. And the second one is postmodern, supposedly emancipatory, deterritorialized, cultural one, and this one is also political in a very subtle manner. Along with the scholars located in academics, there is one more force that appropriated diaspora. So one is the religious institutions, one is the political institutions, one is the literary institutions, departments, universities, but there is one more institution, that is the institution of bureaucracy. And this institution also appropriated the term to its advantage. They appropriated diaspora in the international bureaucratic field. From the early 2000s onwards, some international organizations, in particular the World Bank and International Organizations for Migration, attempted to import diaspora into their own specific lexicon, relying mostly on previous conceptual work by Robert Cohen or Stephen Vertivec, especially Cohen. Experts from these international organizations seized the word diaspora and made diaspora policies a specific dimension of the best practices that newly independent or emerging states were more and more supposed to implement. As Alan Gamlin and Stephen Dufox showed in their respective work, a new definition of diaspora emerged within these expertise. The term now describes expatriate populations who possess citizenship of the homeland or were of national origin and whom states now had to take into consideration and for whom they are strongly incited to implement specific policies aiming at embracing them more efficiently into the space of the nation. Through the work of those international organizations, the word came to be globalized. It is evident that under the changing nature of nationhood and global conditions of nature, scope and definition of the definition of diaspora is changing constantly. In the postmodern age, whole nations are becoming diasporic in relation to their past under the pressure of global media and the vortex of the post-national situation. In the postmodern and post-national age, home is no longer what it once used to be, either for the nation or for the diaspora. Clearly, national memory today in the age of ever more transnational institutions, migrations and networks is being colored ever more by nostalgia and imagined memory. For diaspora in the contemporary age, the age of digitalization, the age of cyberspace, the idea of home has also undergone radical change. When the idea of home has undergone change, the idea of nation and idea of diaspora has also undergone change. Now, even in this conference, we invited good number of speakers from abroad without any passport, without even crossing the physical boundaries or political boundaries. They just sat before their screens and they were in India. So under such circumstances, in the age of uh, digital technologies, in the age of cyber technologies, how the idea of diaspora is undergoing change. In this age of cyber technologies, the diaspora home is not just a concrete geographical place. Rather, it exists in the realm of memory and nostalgia. Cyberspace, just like the psychological space, is a virtual space and attracts the diaspora instantly due to this likeness. Further, it facilitates the formation of contact zones that lead to the emergence of cyborg diaspora or digital diasporas. And when we talk about digital diasporas or diasporas in the age of cyber technologies, there is one more category of diaspora that is emerging. Just imagine, I'm sitting in India in my room, but I am playing online video game with people from USA, England, Canada, Germany. All my partners are from outside India. Now, where is my location? Physically, I am located, but psychologically, I am not. I am not located within the boundaries of nation. So now the we may not just move outside the nation. The outside of the nation may also move within. This one more dimension has added uh, in the age of digital technologies. In this regard, I mean, so while talking about the digital diaspora, Radhika Gajla describes the nature and scope of digital diaspora. What she says about digital diaspora. Digital diasporas occur at the intersection of local global, national international, private public, offline online, and embodied disembodied. In digital diasporas, a multiplicity of representations, mass media broadcasts, textual and visual performances, and interpersonal interactions occur. The material and discursive shaping of community through such digital encounters indicate nuance and layered continuities, discontinuities, conjunctures, and disconjunctures between colonial past on the one hand and supposedly post-colonial present, or rather neo-colonial present and future. The emergence of digital diasporic spaces leads to the creation of not only social and digital spaces of cultural representation, but also contact zones of social spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination. Mary Louise Pratt associates these spaces with phenomenon starting from the colonialism to the present time, when she calls these contact zones the spaces of colonial encounters, the spaces in which people geographically and historically separated, come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of coercion, radical inequality, and intractable conflict. Technology has always been a vital tool for connecting people among themselves. And with their homelands and internet is the latest invention for connecting and empowering people. As Victoria Burnell says, many discussions of cyberspace focus on the empowering potential of computerized access to information. In the same way, Nicholas Negroponte celebrates it as the instantaneous and inexpensive transfer of electronic data that move at the speed of light, through which information can become universally accessible. Diaspora are situated in particular socio-political and geographical locations. They experience displacement across time and space. Therefore, they cannot completely understand themselves by reference to their present location and milieu. It is their predicament to feel out of place, and therefore they strive to make sense of their socio-cultural and political condition. In their bid to understand their cultural location, they construct a social context for themselves that transcends their physical location. This particular predicament of location, dislocation and relocation in space, they share with the virtual world of cyberspace. So here, diaspora and cyberspace, they become companions because they share location, dislocation and relocation in space, which is an appropriate analogy to diaspora because it is no place or any place. It is an imaginatively constructed space, though just like diaspora, uh, just like diaspora people, computers and servers are shifted in specific locations. Therefore, location is ambiguous for both cyberspace and the species of diaspora, which has to be actively constructed and made socially meaningful. Cyberspace and diaspora, forms of social belonging, emerge out of dual process of technological advances in communications and movements of populations across geographical and political boundaries. On the one hand, diaspora and dispersion involves network forms of community and relations. On the other hand, internet involves connections among dispersed users. Therefore, diaspora and internet are homologous to each other because both reflect the shifting social embellishments of postmodernity. And I will like to conclude with one quotation from Pippa Norris, who uh, establishes a relationship between cyberspace and diasporic space. The more utopian vision of the internet suggests a future society in which virtually unlimited quantities of information become available. Civic society flourishes, government decisions making becomes more open and transparent, and nation state borders are eroded as people build virtual communities for work, learning, and leisure, spanning traditional boundaries of time and space. So, with these words, I will like to say thanks to all of you again for listening to me. So, thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now it's time for vote of thanks.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, friends. This is Dr. L.M. Swarnalatha from the host college, Vellalar College for Women, Erode, Tamil Nadu. It is exhilarating to realize that this historic event is coming to an end with thumping applause from every corner of the world. I deem it a great privilege to extend a vote of thanks on this finale session. This event will be remembered as a milestone in the webinar series that is happening around. Let me first of all start by giving a glory to the Almighty God for making this conference a resounding success. First and foremost, I thank Dr. Jaising of IFLU for gracing this important event with minute-to-minute guidance and for bringing in the international resource persons. We are all inspired by your pillar support. I, on behalf of the institution and on my own behalf, extend a very hearty note of gratitude Dr. Nalini Iyer from USA, Dr. Jasmina from Hungary, Dr. Clara Chamber from England, Dr. Ravinder Gill from Canada, Dr. Siddharth from Chennai, and Dr. Chitra from Bhutan. The very presence of the Honorable Vice Chancellor, Pondicherry University, Professor Gurmeet Singh, on the first day, in spite of his extremely busy schedule, is a reflection of the importance that is attached to the commitment of education. Thank you very much, sir. We are extremely thankful to Professor Dr. Kiran Araro from Jalandhar for her erudite introspection with a sweet smile. I would like to take this opportunity to express a hearty thanks to our Secretary and Correspondent, Thiru S.D. Chandrasekhar, and Principal Dr. S.K. Jayanti for their uninstinct support from the beginning till the end. We are thankful to all our chairpersons for their support and cooperation. I also extend my thanks to all my colleagues. My special thanks to Dr. A. Vanitha, Dr. Gokila, Dr. Janaki, Ms. Lalita, Dr. Selvi, Dr. Kartiga, Dr. Soundarya, Dr. Sumati, Dr. Mogana Sundari, and Dr. Punita, Dr. Sudhalakshmi, Ms. Farita Banu, Dr. Surya, Ms. Sindhu, and Ms. Suganya. I would like to take this opportunity to express my hearty thanks to Ms. Meghala and Mr. Muthukumar for their technical support. I must mention a deep sense of appreciation for these paper presenters who have diligently presented their perspectives and answered the queries. Once again, I thank you all for your support, guidance, and cooperation. Team efforts always win. Thank you, friends. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. So thanks to all of you, and it was a wonderful event. So I hope in future also we will collaborate.
So a wonderful valedictory address. Sir.
Your wonderful valedictory address, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Anyway, if somebody has a question, they can ask me.
No person.
No question, only compliment.
So thank you, ma'am. Now, shall I end the meeting?
In the international conference.
In the international conference.
Recording I will send you soon.
Sir?
Recording I will send you very soon.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Yarda?